أنتم تستمعون إلى الديوانية.
نخيم מאזינים לדיווניה.
דיוانية ديناميك business. אתם מקשיבים לדיוانية.
أنتم تستمعون إلى ديوانية.
From the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, you're listening to Diwaniyya.
Hi and welcome to Diwaniyya. I'm Ben Silsby and I'm here today with Duygu Atlas, and we're going to talk about the ongoing situation in Turkey and the protests in Gezi Park, Taksim Square, and all over the country. Duygu, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Duygu Atlas. I'm a PhD candidate at Tel Aviv University at the Graduate School of History. I'm also a junior researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies.
Thanks for coming on the show. So give us some background about the protests. They started off initially as environmental demonstrations, correct?
It was a protest of a small group of environmentalists. They were basically protesting against the government's decision to rebuild the Ottoman barracks at the Gezi Park. And they said maybe they would turn it into a shopping center or a residential building. So it was basically a handful of people protesting peacefully at the Gezi Park. But when there was police intervention, it quickly became a mass movement.
Do you think there's a historical significance to rebuilding the Ottoman barracks? Is there...
You know, historians in Turkey have been debating about it. And one of the leading historians in Turkey, he said that if we talk about rebuilding Ottoman buildings, there are more significant ones to build before we come to the Topçukuşla. So this is the name of the Ottoman barracks that the government was planning to build. So I think there's no significance to that decision. But it signifies for most people something totally else. This is the government's meddling in the public sphere as well as in their private lives. So that's why this movement have quickly become a mass protest, because people from all walks of life have taken to the streets to protest against an increasingly authoritarian attitude of the Justice and Development Party under the Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And this has a few reasons.
In the international press, there's been a perception that the AKP is fairly popular and stable in Turkey. So you're saying as long as 2 years ago, that perception started to change.
There was some discontent among the people. The thing is, since the AKP came to power, there were always doubts about if they have a hidden agenda. What do they really want to do? Are they threatening to the secular Kemalist regime? And quickly, AKP proved everyone wrong, because they portrayed a very Western-looking, very reform-seeking government. And that's why they gathered a lot of support among Turkish intellectuals, Turkish liberals, and they initiated very impressive reform packages, especially on the Kurdish issue. This is the most well-known one. And about educational rights, minority rights for the non-Muslim minorities. But I would say the last 2 years, AKP has become more one-sided and more authoritative in its outlook.
What do you think has led to this turn?
I think it's popularity. Because the AKP is the first party in Turkish history who has won 3 consecutive elections. And this gives a lot of power to Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And I think he believes that he has the support of all Turkish citizens. So when he decides to do something, he believes that he has the backing of everyone. He has a very clear idea what a good Turkish citizen should be. The thing is, the pressure and the disgruntlement was brewing. The government wanted to restrict the number of C-section operations and the abortions that are being done in Turkey.
Why cesarean sections?
Because for the government, it's very important to keep population young. And according to what I heard in the Turkish press, it is believed that if a woman goes through a C-section, it reduces her fertility. The thing is, we have great economic success, and the government relies on a young population. So that's why also the Prime Minister Erdogan's call for women, that they should have at least 3 children. These were the first two things, basically, that got people protesting out on the streets. And the second one, although people didn't take out on the streets, but there was great buzz on social media about it, was the ban on alcohol. It's not a ban on alcohol, but it's the restrictive use of alcohol.
And to my understanding, there's not really much of a drinking problem in Turkey to begin with.
No, in Turkish culture, it's very acceptable. I would say there are those who don't drink, and there are those who drink, and it's a big part of our culture. And I don't remember people being in conflict with each other because of this, because of the consumption of alcohol, or that it has ever been an issue, that it has caused a major problem in Turkish society. It's always been that way, but suddenly we started talking about it. First of all, the government put very heavy taxes on cigarettes and alcohol. And secondly, only recently, they passed a law that prohibited the sale of alcohol from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning. And they said the places that sell alcohol should not be in the 100-meter vicinity of places of education and mosques. And in a country which attracts millions of tourists every year, this may be very problematic, because you really don't pay attention to where you open your store or where you drink it.
Right.
So people basically interpret it as AKP's attempt to lead a social engineering project, to transform the Turkish society into what it believes should be the good Muslim Turkish citizen. And not everyone agrees with that, with their definition, especially the young generation. That brings us to the Gezi Park.
Excellent. I was going to ask how this fits into the Gezi Park protests.
Okay, the Gezi Park protests, we said that it started as the protest movement of a small group of people, but it snowballed into something very major, a mass movement that we haven't seen in Turkish history for a long time. And people participating in it, the young generation, they were considered as the apolitical generation in Turkey. Children that are addicted to internet, that they don't have really much of an opinion about politics. So now everyone sees that they all proved us wrong, and they even got us to join them.
How many of these young people do you think were AKP voters? Any of them?
I think that there are AKP voters, but it's hard to say what's the percentage.
Sure.
Because we see, for instance, young women wearing headscarf joining the protests, and they say, we want their rights to be respected as well as our right to wear a headscarf. And I'm sure there were AKP voters also among them.
Who is an AKP voter? Who votes for them? What demographic tends to support that?
I would say it's a very versatile group. You don't necessarily have to be a strict conservative Muslim to vote for the AKP in Turkey. A lot of people voted for Recep Tayyip Erdogan because of his success in the economic field and because he brought stability, because he took very impressive steps towards ending Turkey's festering Kurdish problem. And he opened up what was considered as taboo subjects in Turkish history to public discussion, like the minority issues, what we did to the Kurds, what was the Kemalist project. And because he was an underdog himself, he quickly found a very large crowd that would support him, from some leftists who suffered from the Kemalist regime as much as the Islamists, to liberals, to intellectuals, to actual conservatives who would just vote for the AKP because of its Islamic roots. So it's a very versatile group.
Do you think the protests show that he's really lost the support of these sort of outside groups, these non-conservative groups that have voted for him in the past?
I would say yes. I've been reading a lot of articles by leading journalists and intellectuals on Turkish media, and they say that Erdogan has lost my support. He was on a trip to North Africa when the protests... So when he was gone, Abdullah Gül, the president, he was making very moderate statements to cool things down. And I think everyone expected that Erdogan would come back and understand, and he would say, okay, young children, I understand where you come from and I understand your concerns, and I'm ready to sit with you, because I think that is the image that he has given to the Turkish public. And people were relying on his balcony speeches, for instance. He introduced balcony speeches into the Turkish political scene. He would go up to the balcony, and in 2011 again, when he was elected for the third time, he said, I am the prime minister of 74 million of all of you. I think people believed in him. He's a very good orator. He knows how to talk. And I think there was some hope that he would come back and negotiate with the people and hear them out. But when he came back, he adopted a very tough stance towards these people and how he categorized them as looters and as environmentalists, as marginal groups, and he was ready to recognize only the environmentalists as the legitimate group.
How tough did he get?
He even said that he gave the police the order to act on the protesters. He met with a group of artists, intellectuals, when the protests were going on, to talk about the protests and what could be done about it. And also the mayor of Istanbul did the same thing. So people were thinking, okay, maybe there's really a dialogue, which is also a new thing in Turkish political scene. So people were, I think, hopeful that something may come out of all these talks. But at the very same time, there was a very heavy police crackdown on protesters. And it got very violent. And as you know, a few people died. And a lot of people were injured. But I think it's transforming itself all the time. After there was the last police crackdown on protesters, so the very next day we are introduced with this new phenomena in Turkey, the standing man. So they said, if we cannot protest, we will just stand. And even the police and the mayor, they had to say, okay, we cannot do really anything about it because they're just standing. And as a protest to the standing man, those government supporters, they introduced the turning man. A group of people, they just like turn in circles. So I think what we see is a very interesting thing for democracy.
One thing that's really kind of both impressed and amused me about these protests is the really acute use of humor. Can you tell us about the penguins?
During the first few days, the Turkish mainstream media failed in reporting from the field and basically reporting at all about the Taksim Gezi protests. And at the same time, when the protests were going on one news channel, they were showing a documentary about penguins. And people just took that and they started using penguins as a symbol. Even the group who met with the mayor of Istanbul, when they left the meeting with him, they walked out with a penguin walk from the building. That's why they say what we see now is something very different, because people use humor to protest against the government. Someone from the government says something and it kind of goes back to them in a very humoristic way. So there is nowhere to...
No, and they've maintained this humor in the face of violent crackdowns and even deaths among the protesters.
They have.
Let's talk about the chapuling.
Chapuling. Yes, we introduced a new verb to the English language.
Where does this word come from? I've seen a lot of YouTube videos. Every day I'm chapuling. It's on graffiti all over the place. What is it? Chapuling.
It comes from a speech by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, our prime minister. He called the protesters çapulcu in Turkish, which has been translated to English as looters. So people picked it up very quickly and it became the main slogan, basically, of the protesters. And now if you look at Facebook, those who support the protests, they add çapulcu in front of their names on their Facebook profiles. And the same goes with Twitter also. Speaking
of YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, I understand that, as in many of the recent social movements, social media is considered to be a driver of this. What's your take on this? You mentioned that the protesters were mixed groups of young people and older people who might not be using social media as much. But what do you think is the role of these social media networks, internet?
It has been very significant. People have been using Twitter especially to coordinate among themselves. And when there was a heavy police crackdown, they used Twitter to notify people around where there would be makeshift aid stations, and also to say where they could hide, where there is food, and where there is water, where there is police. So they use Twitter heavily also to upload pictures and videos of what is actually going on. And this has come also as a protest to the mainstream Turkish media, because they thought that they cannot rely on Turkish TV or Turkish newspapers to report correctly on what was going on the field. So they said, they even started a campaign called "We Are All Journalists, We Are All Reporting." So they started reporting themselves. That's why Twitter has been the most efficient, and also Facebook.
Would you say that the youth in Turkey are, in general, internet and social network users? I mean, this is something that I assume predates the protest movement itself.
It does. I'm sure there are differences among regions, because not every region is as developed, but I think everyone owns a cellular phone in Turkey, it's safe to say, and everyone uses internet, especially the young generation. So they're very well informed and they very well know how to transmit information very fast. So they are very technologically literate.
I'd like to address the Kurdish aspect to this. This has been something that I wish the international press, at least, had been saying more about, because prior to these protests, the big news about Turkey was sort of this reconciliation with Öcalan and developments with maybe not the integration, but at least lessening some of the discrimination against Kurds. Can you tell us how that plays into the current affairs?
Prime Minister Erdogan has taken very big steps towards ending the Kurdish problem in Turkey. And he has done very unprecedented things to end this conflict. This has raised hopes among the Kurdish population also. Kurdish role in the protests, they have been cautious, but one of the first people who stood out in the protests was Sırrısı Süreyya Özdemir. And he is a BDP deputy. BDP is the pro-Kurdish party at the parliament. He was there during the first days of the Gezi Park protests. He was putting himself in front of the bulldozers to protect the trees from being uprooted. So he has become a symbol, basically, of the protests. But he was also banned now. He's been banned from going to İmralı to talk to Öcalan. There are committees that on a regular basis go to the İmralı Island to hold talks with Öcalan. So he's been banned by the government to go there. But Öcalan said, he released a statement and he said, despite some hiccups, basically, we are continuing with the peace process. It's still on track. But when we look at the Kurdish people actually on the ground at the Gezi Park, they were there. There was a BDP tent at the Gezi Park. And from what I read from the social media, there was some mingling, but they also said, the BDP people, they're doing their own thing, they're there. But in my opinion, one of the most extraordinary things that has come out of the protests was the bridging of the gaps, forming some kind of dialogue between Turks and Kurds. Because I keep hearing Turkish people, as a result of the Turkish media's failure to report on the Gezi Park protests. Now they ask some very significant questions, one of them being, have we been well informed about the Kurdish issue? And I see some posts also apologizing from our Kurdish brothers, saying, I am really sorry, maybe we haven't been well informed, maybe there is something else to it. What I heard from Kurdish people also, they say, we are really happy that this is happening so that now the Turks understand what we have been going through for 30 years. So we'll see. It will be a great test for Turkish justice system and also for Turkish democracy, what we're seeing now. And it's not going to die down anytime soon because we have a lot of questions to answer. We have a lot of soul searching to do, both for the government and also for the protesters. And I believe it to be a new phase in Turkish democracy where we learn how to communicate, where we know how to listen, when we are more informed about our democratic rights. And also for the government, that now they know that they will have to meet with groups who represent something. They will have to take them into consideration, that it cannot be a single party rule strictly within their framework and strictly within their ideology. So we will have a lot of negotiating to do in Turkey. And I hope it will end well for everyone.
I as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of Diwaniyya was produced and edited by Ben Silsby and engineered by Shoshi Shmulevitz. Diwaniyya is made possible through the support of the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. To find out more about the Dayan Center, please visit its website at www.dayan.com. To learn more about Diwaniyya, please visit the Diwaniyya blog at diwaniyya.blogspot.com.